Hello, everyone. My name is Ashley Robinson, and I'm the editor of the Alberta Seed Guide. Today, we have Sheri Strydhorst here with us to share a bit of a how-to guide on how to select a variety using the Alberta Seed Guide tables that you receive every year in the spring issue. So I'll just quickly introduce Sheri here. And Sheri is the principal of Sheri's Ag Consulting, and Sheri Strydhorst has over 20 years of experience in research in the agricultural industry. Her career has focused on enhancing the profitability of Canadian crop producers. She believes in research that aligns with the grower needs while upholding scientific rigor. She has built strong relationships with researchers, industry, and producers. She has a long history of extending research findings so that they resonate with farmers. Sheri completed her Bachelor of Science, Master of Science, and PhD at the University of Alberta. Her Master of Science research studied faba bean agronomy, and her PhD research studied the rotational benefits of pulse crops. After graduate school, Sheri worked as the executive director for the Alberta Pulse Growers. She returned to research in 2013, where she focused on cereal agronomy with Alberta Agriculture until 2021. She then worked for Alberta Wheat and Barley Commissions as their agronomy research specialist. Last fall, Sheri established Sheri's Ag Consulting, Inc., where she provides consulting services in the areas of research, strategy, ag strategy, regional variety trial management, data analysis, and extension. Please take it away, Sheri.
Thank you, Ashley, and hello, everyone. So as Ashley said, I'm Dr. Sheri Strydhorst, and today I am coming to you as the Alberta Regional Variety Trial Coordinator. So I work for ARVAC, which is the Alberta Regional Variety Advisory Committee, and I am hired under contract by the Alberta Wheat Commission to do this work. So let's get going and talk about how to use the seed guide to select a variety. Now, this was a publication from a year ago, and it's a study that was done at the University of Saskatchewan. And what they found was that for every farmer dollar invested in wheat breeding, so for example, the levy that you pay to the Wheat Commission, farmers receive $33 benefit back to the farm, which is tremendous. But to be able to recognize that value, you need to get the right genetics on your farm. And that's what we're going to look at today. So what we're going to focus on is the January 2023 seed guide, and I'm going to use tables from that. I am a bit of a wheat person, so we're going to focus on the Canadian Western Red Spring Wheat table. And you can see that how does a producer pick? There are 47 varieties listed in the seed guide, each of them with different attributes and benefits for different environments, but it can be overwhelming. So we really encourage growers to look at multiple sources of information. And the first one, and I think the foundation of this, is the Alberta Seed Guide. And to use that in connection with marketing information from seed companies, which we'll look at that and the pros and the cons, firsthand experience from neighbors who have maybe grown one of these varieties already. Seed growers, they're the first ones in your area to get the variety in and to see how it performs in your local environment, and local experts, retailers, or government scientists and staff. So I'm going to pick on my seed company friends for just a second, and they truly are friends, but it's important to understand how this marketing information can be challenging to assess different varieties. So at the top corner here, we've got CCAN and Dr. Rhonda Powell, a breeder who is retired from AAFC Swift Current, and he's standing by a sign for AAC Brandon wheat. And you can see in the sign that it's 5% higher yielding than AC Carberry. But that's a challenge if you're a grower who hasn't grown Carberry and is not familiar with that variety. And then next, we look at an ad from FP Genetics for AAC Hockley, and we can see that it is high yielding, 109% of the checks. And then we have to go, oh, well, multiple checks, how do I compare that? And then over to the ad from Alliance for AAC Leroy, and here we see that it's Leroy's out yielding Viewfield by 11% and Unity by 10% in Western Canadian registration trials. And we start going, wow, there's different comparisons that we're making and from potentially different trials. So it can be very confusing. And that is where the regional variety trials, or the RVTs, I tend to use that acronym, come in. And these are great trials because they're third-party independent trials, and they're a really trusted resource because what they're doing is they're assessing variety performance under standardized conditions unbiased conditions and relative to a known check. So in wheat, for example, our check is AAC branded, and that's such a common check. So there's a lot of grower familiarity with that. We do test in multiple geographies across Alberta, and we'll look at a map of what that looks like. But this is not a cheap program to run. And you can see in my picture here, the field time from 2022, the financial support that we have. And I've added Western Grains Research Foundation, but for them, they came in as funders in 2023. We have funding support from ARDAR, the Wheat Commissions, Alberta Barley, Alberta Seed Processors, Alberta Oak Growers, Alberta British Columbia Seed Growers. And together, this program costs nearly $500,000 to run. So you can see there's a huge amount of financial investment in this, but there's also great benefit. And we want everyone to be able to make use of this resource that we're putting a ton of effort into. And just to give the kudos to the funders again, 52% of the costs are covered by ARDAR, or Results-Driven Agricultural Research, and Western Grains Research Foundation, with the balance being covered by seed companies who pay entry fees for the varieties they have tested in these trials, Alberta, British Columbia seed growers, Alberta seed processors, Alberta oak growers, Alberta wheat, and many others. Now, these are the trials that we have for that CWRS wheat that's grown at 15 locations in 2023. These are my individual sites with the cooperators, and you can see they stretch all the way from the far north at Fort Vermilion down to southern Alberta at Lethbridge under both irrigated and dry land conditions. So a tremendous amount of effort and work is put into these trials that generates data for the seed guide. Now, I want to go through a little history of the key or the big acre varieties that have been grown in Alberta. And you can see we've got CDC Go, which was applied for registration with CFIA, or the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, back in 2003. So old genetics, and we kind of go through the history. Stettler then became very popular, Brandon very popular, very significant acres of Viewfield, and there's starting to be very significant acres of wheatland. And you can see this trend of increasing yield. So you can see that yields are increasing, and there's a trend for plant type to get shorter. And these are very good things that our breeders are making progress with varieties. Maybe on the flip side, though, we have this trend where protein tends to be decreasing, and that's that inverse relationship between yield and protein. That as you get more yield, your protein tends to drop because you're distributing that nitrogen among fewer kernels of grain. But the other great place where our breeders have made progress is in Fusarium head blight genetic resistance. And you can see this trend where CDC Go has a moderate susceptibility to Brandon being moderately resistant, and our newer lines with intermediate ratings. So you can see this overall progress, but there's not one clear winner. And that's where farmers need to make decisions about what is the best variety for their farm. So typically growers will open the seed guide and they will look at that yield column of data. And in the CWRS table, there are typically 3 yield values reported. First, there is the overall yield based on data from all the sites where the variety was grown and tested in multiple years. And then we have performance in high and low yield categories. And we're going to look at an example of this and really dig into that. But a grower who's located in Oyen, who probably has a typical yield around 40 bushels per acre, is going to look at variety performance in the low yield category, whereas a grower located in Lacombe or under irrigation, where they're pushing 80, 90, 100 bushels per acre of CWRS wheat, are going to be looking at variety performance in the high yield category. So on the next slide, we're going to look at the table and go through an example with Eli, Viewfield, and also with wheatland. So here's the table, and as you can see, the Canadian Western Red Spring Wheat table from the January 2023 seed guide, and our varieties are listed here. Brandon is our check, that very commonly grown variety. It was mostly recently tested in 2022, and it's been grown in 101 station years of testing, so a big database there. Now, overall, in the small plots, Brandon was yielding 75 bushels per acre. In the low yield environments, it yielded 59 bushels per acre, and in the high yield environments, 95 bushels per acre. Now, I want to clarify that as yields in the small plot conditions. Field scale yields are lower because everything in a small plot, all the weeds are hand weeded out. It's on a perfect piece of soil. There's not those low spots. There's not areas you have to go around. So if we were to convert these small plot yields to field scale yields, we'd look at overall yields of 56 bushels per acre, which is close to typical on a typical year, whatever that is. And then on our low yield column, that's equivalent to growers who are achieving yields of 44 bushels per acre or less for their CWRS wheat. And high yield environments are defined as those that would be equivalent to 71 bushels per acre or more. So that's what these three categories mean. And if we first look, my apologies, at wheatland, and you can see that it was last tested in 2020, 36 station years of data, and overall it yielded 104% of Brandon. In the low environment, it yielded 104% of Brandon, and in the high yield environment, it yielded 104% of Brandon. So what this variety has is yield stability across low and high yielding environments, which is really nice if you don't know what Mother Nature is going to send you that growing season. So it has that consistency of performance. However, if you know what kind of yield environment you're in, and let's look at Eli next, you can see that it's over its 15 station years of testing, it yielded 103% of Brandon. But in a low yield environment, it yielded 105% of Brandon. And in a high yield environment, it yielded the equivalent of Brandon. So if you are in this low yield environment, you can see how Eli is a superior choice for that environment. Now, if you're in a high yield environment, you might want to consider something like Viewfield. So again, it has 103% of Brandon for the yield, the same as Eli, but in a low yield environment, it underperforms compared to Brandon and overperforms in the high yield environment. So you can see if you're in a high yield environment that Viewfield is really an ideal choice. So this is how you use those different yield categories. The next thing I want to note, and you might have noticed that some of the varieties in the table had a VB following their name, and I'm just going to flip back and highlight where you can see Elida VB, Broadacres VB, Hodge VB, and so forth. So what does that VB mean? It means, or it stands for varietal blend, and it is listed for varieties that have the SM1 gene. Now, the SM1 gene confers resistance to the orange wheat blossom midge, which can result in both grade and yield losses. So here, this is the indication of that genetic resistance to that insect pest. And in areas where there is that pressure, it is estimated that producers achieve $70 per acre in yield and grade benefits, and that's based on a wheat price of $10 per bushel. So if you are not familiar with this, I'd encourage you to check out midgetolerantwheat.ca and learn more about it, because it might be an important fit when you're selecting a variety. Now, the next consideration is when we look at maturity and lodging. Now, growers should carefully consider their maturity ratings, and particularly in areas where we've got short growing seasons. So maturity ratings are based on average differences in days relative to the check. So is this one faster maturing than that one? And these, again, are relative values. So if you've got a hot, dry condition, drought conditions like what we had in 2021, if the seed guide says the variety will mature in 104 days, that drought stress might actually make it mature in 95 days if things are quite severe. On the flip side, if we have cool, wet conditions, instead of 104 days to mature, it's going to mature in 108 days or something along those lines. So you can see that it is the relative difference we're interested in rather than the absolute. And the other example, just to highlight, is that a variety in Lethbridge might mature in 98 days, whereas if we go up to Edmonton, it might take 103 days to mature. So let's take a look here at maturity, and then we'll dig into an example of lodging. So here again, the same Canadian Western Red Spring wheat table that we just looked at, and we're going to zone in on this maturity rating column. So you can see that Brandon is listed as having an overall average maturity of 104 days. And again, that's average, and weather conditions, as you all know, will affect that. But if we are going to zone in on a grower who is struggling with getting that crop to mature in the right season. So perhaps they had to harvest in the spring, heaven forbid, and were faced with that, or if they have lowland that tends to freeze off, or if they just know they can't get that crop in as early, these are varieties to consider where you can see they're -2, -3, -2 days relative to Brandon. So there is reduced days to maturity for these varieties. And you can see there is a bit of a trade-off here, and you can see the yield of those varieties is less than a lot of the other ones. And a lot of what that has to do with is if you have that crop or that variety with 2 to 3 to 5 days of less photosynthesis, that is less days of turning that sunlight into sugars and that sugar into yield. And that's where we get these earlier maturing varieties, because they're photosynthesizing for fewer days, that they have that bit of a yield penalty. But the question the grower needs to ask themselves is, does this reduced days to maturity offset the lower grade you might have if you have been caught with snow covering your crop before it's harvested, if you have been caught with wet weather and not able to harvest a crop and you get sprouting and you get downgraded from a number 1 to a feed? Those are where these are really important considerations if you are in an environment where the length of your growing season is a realistic constraint. So the next column to look at is very environment dependent is the lodging column. So if you are in that low yielding environment where you're typically getting less than 44 bushels, this is not a column for you to give a lot of mindfulness to. If you are in an environment where you're pulling off 90 bushels, 100 bushels under irrigation or on thick black soils, this becomes a very important column for you. So it is variety or environment dependent, and you need to assess your lodging risk. And you can see that Brandon, many growers have grown this. It has a good lodging rating. If Brandon is not standing well enough for you, then you have to look at varieties with a VG, and a variety with an F standability is probably not a choice for you if you have trouble with Brandon. However, if you're in an environment where CDC Go stands just perfect and it's given a fair rating, then you don't need to give heavy weight of importance to this lodging category. So again, need to assess these different columns based on their importance in your environment. The next set of information we have in the tables is the disease resistance. So the data in the guide reflects genetic differences between cultivars. And one thing that often surprises people is that fungicides are not used in these trials. The guide reports on 3 of the 5 priority 1 diseases, being bunt, stripe rust, and fusarium head blight. Now, the data for these ratings comes from inoculated disease nurseries where they are irrigating these to keep the conditions wet and ideal for disease propagation. They are using strains from Western Canada so that we are testing the genetic resistance against the strains that are in farmers' fields. And I want to zone in on FHB because that's maybe the tough nut to crack in terms of disease resistance. If we had a resistant variety of CWRS wheat, which we don't, that I want to be clear that that would not equate to immunity. Under severe epidemics of fusarium infection, all varieties will sustain damage. So it is a bit of a relative scale, but definitely there are genetic improvements. And when we look at the table here, again, the same table we've been looking at, and you can see that the variety CDC Abound it was most recently tested in 2010, so certainly an older variety, and it has a susceptible rating. CDC Go has an MS rating. So I think when there are so many other choices with MR ratings, that's a really easy switch for you to make, especially if you are in an environment where fusarium pressure is high, or you're trying to maintain low fusarium graminearum levels for as long as possible. Having a switch to a variety with improved fusarium resistance is really a very smart move for the long-term health of your farm. So you can see, again, depending on your environment, you have to give different weight to these different categories of information in the seed guide. Now we've got a little bit of information on quality. In the years where we have wet harvest, this becomes even more important. So we do provide pre-harvest sprouting ratings, and these give a very indirect indication of falling number. So if a variety has a P or a poor sprouting rating, that means it's more likely to sprout under cool, wet conditions than a variety that has a VG or a very good rating. And reductions in falling number are often an indication that germination has started, the enzymes have activated, even though you might not see a sprout coming out of that seed. And again, like that fusarium issue, if we have cold, wet weather at harvest, all varieties, regardless of their rating, are susceptible to sprouting and reductions in falling number. So again, when we look at this column on resistance to sprouting, you can see that Brandon, as our check, has a poor sprouting resistance rating. But if you have been burnt by sprouting, looking at something like an Elida with a VG, or there's a number of different good options here. If you are in an environment where harvest is always dry, this isn't a big consideration. If you are in an environment where there is often wetness at the time of harvest, you need to put more importance on this sprouting rating column of data. And the final quality trait we have is data related to protein requirements, or protein ratings, I should say. Now, growers are starting to achieve or starting to have problems achieving minimum protein requirements. And if you are struggling to get your 13.5 protein, this is a column of data you need to be looking at. So if a variety has plus 0.7 protein relative to the check, it will likely have a higher protein concentration than a variety with a minus 0.3% protein rating. And again, this is the same, assuming the same nitrogen fertility management and the same environment, because those factors play huge havoc with protein. But if you can select a variety that has a better chance of achieving high protein, if that's something you're struggling with, then this is a column of data you should look at. So here we've got our protein column, and you can see that Brandon is listed at 14%, and Broad Acres has a nice high yield, but there's that bit of a protein reduction with that. Whereas Hodge, you can see again 104% of the check in the overall yield, but its protein reduction is minus 0.3. So if you're struggling with protein, Hodge might be an option to be looking at. If you're really struggling with protein, though, something like a Red Star has a plus 0.1, and its yield is 96%. So you can see here, we're starting to see that inverse relationship between yield and protein. And one other example is RedNet has a plus 1 or a plus 0.1 protein, and again, 97% of the check for yield. So it is very environment specific, and it's always a bunch of give and take for selecting a variety. Now, I want to go through a scenario of the give and take and making trade-offs when selecting a variety. And as I was going through the data from 2022, the Durham wheat trial at Bow Island, and I know everyone doesn't grow Durham wheat, but it had a great example of trade-offs. And this is 1 year of data, and we don't publish 1 year of data. We only publish 6 site years of data over 2 growing seasons, but I've got everything coded so you don't know what is what, but just it's the trade-off conversation. So here is when I get the data from our trial cooperators, I color code everything and make sure everything looks right, that tall varieties are tall and short varieties are tall. And I look at this strong field is the check, transcend is our benchmark check. And as I color code this, I go, wow, variety G is like 10 centimeters shorter nearly than everything else out there. That is really exciting because I'm from an area where lodging is a big issue. And then I look at the lodging data and I go, wow, look at variety G on a 1 to 9 scale. It's at a 4 with 1 being upright. I'm excited about that. And variety H is kind of making me nervous about how badly that is lodging. So I'm really excited at this point about variety G. Then I look at the yield data and I go, oh, variety G, it's the lowest variety. But then I look at the highest yielding variety and I go, oh, variety D looks pretty good. So if I go back and look at my lodging data, I go, well, you know what? It actually had the second highest lodging rating. So that's good. It's, it's 98 centimeters. So one of the second shortest varieties. So maybe I've got to do a little give and take with variety D, or if lodging is that big of a problem, to give that consideration. And I think this is just a great data set to demonstrate all the factors that a grower is trying to balance between when selecting a variety. Because on top of this lodging, height, yield combination, they need to be looking at the disease resistance, the insect resistance, the sprouting, and so forth. So clearly variety choice is not easy, but you can see just how much benefit there can be when you do go through these exercises. Now, on one of our earlier slides, we looked at how those older yielding varieties or those older release varieties, our CDC Go and Stettler, had lower yields. They were taller with poorer lodging ratings and poorer disease resistance. And as we have gone through time and new varieties are registered, we see improvements in yield, height reductions, improvements in standability, improvements in stripe rust resistance, improvements in FHB resistance. But what is the meaning of that on farm? So the next quick little data that we're going to look at, this is from the Canadian Grain Commission website, and it is crop insurance data, and it shows you the acres of different varieties. And you can see this orange line is Brandon. So in 2018, Brandon was grown on 21% of the CWRS wheat acres, and it peaked in 2020 being grown on 35% of the CWRS wheat acres in Alberta, and starts to drop off here as we get to 2022. But what's exciting here is when we look at the green line for wheatland, and you can see this upward trend. So it was completed its RVT testing in 2020, and we start to get seed stock for farmers to grow in 2021 and 2022. And the economic advantage of switching to a new variety, and just in terms of yield, and there's so much more than just yield. This is kind of the example, the math that I went through. If we said those new acres of wheatland in 2022 were stolen from AAC Brandon, and wheatland, we saw in the tables, had a 4% yield advantage over Brandon. It's got the orange blossom wheat midge resistance. We've got that going on, and we see that 4.1% increase equates to 2.1 bushels on farm, and that is an additional 771,000 bushels of CWRS wheat being grown in Alberta, equivalent to nearly $9 million from just switching to new genetics. So this is just a big picture overview of how important it is to select a variety for all these multiple traits for your specific geography. And I really encourage you to try it on your farm. Assess your situation, what you're struggling with, and what genetic technologies can help you out. Try it for your farm online at seed.ab.ca or the printed version. I know a lot of people keep these around for years. These came to all rural mailboxes. So give it a shot for yourself and see what you can do for selecting a new variety for your farm for the upcoming season. Thank you very much.